our last day, we had almost, which is unusual for COPA, we had an almost 100% record on all of our speakers showing up, but there's some chance today that Ted Schrock won't be able to get here and speak, and Paul Nara's negotiating with him to see. They're not even sure they can get over there into West Hollywood. I guess there's some parades and things that are in the way, so we don't know, whether he's going to be able to come. One option is I could show the second gun. I do have it DVD, and we have the projector and sound. So if people want to watch the film, if he doesn't come, we could do that. But I figured we would open with the, with what I wanted to deal with about COPA, and then we'll see where we are in about an hour and try to figure out what's happening. But it's been, in my view, a really good conference, and people have been. We got a lot of people here. We got some press and a lot of attention nationally. I noticed last night on the blog on our site, politicalassassinations.com, that the USA Today had us in some kind of an event column. So, this is more. AP, National Wire. We just never get mentioned by a local newspaper, much less way the hell up there. It took us 10 years for a Dallas Morning News person to come out and ask us what we were doing on the grassy knoll. He said, "Why are you still out here?" I said, "Same reason your boss sent you out to ask me." It's a topic that doesn't die, but we're the ones that you pay attention to the least because we're making some sense. Somebody was up there on the knoll one year. I remember a press person said, "What's the craziest theory you ever heard about the Kennedy assassination?" And he said, "Warren Commission." And so he said, "No, seriously." He said, "No, I'm being serious." So, but I was also wanting to recommend a film. If you get a chance to see it, I don't think it's out. I saw a preview, but it should come out commercially somehow this year, called Apocalypse Africa. And it's by a black journalist, mainstream journalist who quit his job to make this film, and it starts with Eisenhower in the 1950s and with internal CIA memos about destabilizing the African continent and about pitting people against each other. And they were building on colonial policies in Africa, especially a German model that was developed to arm tribal factions, arm both sides and have them kill each other. In order to,
What's that title again, John?
Apocalypse Africa. And it starts with the memos about destabilization, but also the authorization to do the assassinations, Patrice Lumumba, and a number of other countries that are destabilized there. But it was interesting to me that the person who developed this particular technique, and it's not unknown to have tribes, go against each other, but usually they would arm one side against the other, their allies against their enemies, and have them fight it out. But this was like, let's arm both sides and just get them to kill each other, reduce the population, reduce the control. And it was Hermann Goering's father, one of Hitler's main lieutenants, that actually carried on that German colonial policy in one of the African countries. But it's an interesting film, and a lot of people don't know that just in the Congo alone there have been 5 million deaths due to U.S. Intervention and and policies that go back through all of these different administrations. But they do have information there about the political assassinations as well. And a lot of people, here we are all these years later. It is the 40th anniversary, and people think about the past on anniversaries, but a lot of people don't know why do we do this, or what's it got to do with the present, or, so what, they killed some guy. It's kind of like for my generation, the Lincoln assassination. What does it mean to me, But I think people do understand that there was power shifts that went on in this country in the 1960s, and we're in the next century now, but the forces that came into power, that rose, the rise of what Eisenhower warned about, the military-industrial intelligence complex was his original draft, are still here, and many of the people that were involved in these assassinations and other things, or their proxies, are still in positions of power. And especially since the end of World War II, we have this national security state and a military state that just continues to grow in size and influence in the society, as Eisenhower warned that it would. And it predispositions, permanent warfare, predispositions ends of civil liberties in the country and other things, depending on how it's done. But I also know that they plan ahead, and a lot of people know this story about my mother, but some of you don't. I came from a Pentagon family. There were civilians that worked in the Pentagon. My mother, my father, my aunt all worked there. My mother was the highest paid woman in the Pentagon for many years. She was GS-13, which was high for a woman then when she retired in the 70s, and she'd been there since the Pentagon opened in 43. And she was smart. She was, whatever intelligence I have, I inherited from her, and she was quick on the little hand calculator. So they moved her up into a position under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, or DESPER, and her job was to project the national draft call. And she had to do a projection based on, this is our current force level, this is where we want to be down the pike, so how many, and then she would have like actuarial tables, how many people are likely to die, natural causes, retire, be discharged under a category, enlist or re-enlist, therefore how many do we have to draft in order to keep the level or up or down or whatever we want to do. And she would project that on an annual figure. And then that annual figure, which sometimes, like during Vietnam, got up to 50,000 people a year that were going to be drafted, had to be right within 100 people either way in her projection. And she had to get that right 5 years out. So I remember her sweating each year 5 years before whether she had gotten it right. But they replaced her with like 6 employees and 12 computers, but she was doing it right. And I don't know if they're still doing it right, but she retired in 73, and it was interesting to me because she had been a pacifist between World War I and World War II. But then a lot of the pacifist community felt that Hitler was so evil and something had to be done, and so they abandoned the pacifism and got into that. But she showed me some old poems she had written against war when she was young, and then she bought into World War II and then made the transition into the Cold War. By Vietnam, I was already opposing the war in 65. She was freaked out. She thought she'd lose her security clearance, because I was out doing a little bit of vigiling and demonstrating against the war. But she came around on Vietnam, and I educated her in part, but I think the napalm, the civilian level of civilian deaths and other things got her back to some of her pacifist roots. So by the time she retired, she was pretty disgusted with things. So I asked her 3 years after she retired, I said, when did they tell you that they would escalate the war in Vietnam? Because she had to be among the first to know. And she said, in April of 63, on orders from the White House, which means Kennedy, she was told for the first time in her career to change her projections, and to change a projection for a full withdrawal from Vietnam by the end of 1964. And she put that in, and I said, well, when did they reverse that? When did they start to add, a momentum in the other direction? She said late November. I said the last week in November. Something, as we know, happened on Friday the 22nd. She said the Monday following the assassination. I said, was it just a few more advisors? She said, I couldn't believe the figures. She said for the first time she took the figures that she was given to project, because in addition to all that attrition level, from normal things and discharges and enlistment and all that, there was also an Office of Plans that if they were going into a war situation would give her an estimate on wounded and dead attrition to put into the figures. So they had come up with this figure they handed her, and she took it back up to the Joint Chiefs, she said, and she said, these figures can't be right. And they said, those are the figures and you'll project them, put them in. So this is November 25, 63. Kennedy just barely in the grave. His policy was completely reversed. They told her to project a 10-year war in Vietnam with 57,000 American dead, exactly on target. And that's why after 9/11, when they say we're going to war in as many as 60 countries, I listen up, because these people do plan ahead. They plan different responses. I did a talk here in Los Angeles in 1996 called Are You Scared Yet? Because I had been tracking in the 80s Rand Corporation and War College studies saying that, oh, the Cold War is going to end, we're not going to have an enemy, how are we going to keep the budget up for the Pentagon and everything? And so they started coming up with these papers about what? Terrorism and counterterrorism. Domestic terror, international terror. How do you respond to conventional weapon terror? How do you respond to chemical biological terror, nuclear terror? And as you go up those stages, the chart on the end was, you suspend civil liberties, you go to continuity of government, and all of these things. And so, I just had my head in my hands on September 11th because I could see way they were going to go with it and continue to. But these trends and the inability of Kennedy to do what needed to be done and that's why we commemorate on June 10th. We'll be in D.C. commemorating his talk, which we call "And We Are All Mortal." But he wanted to end the Cold War. He wanted to get to Détente with the Soviet Union. He wanted to create a realistic peace. He wanted to stop the nuclear testing and start dismantling the nuclear armament, and was pulling out of Vietnam and trying to make a change in policy. Which I think, there are, of course, and I was talking to Bob Jolling this morning about it, economic and political reasons why wars go on and what drives them through history and that sort of thing, but also policies sometimes can intervene, and there are ways to create diplomacy or not invest yourself in in corporate agendas, but rather in international agendas. And I feel if the amount, I think I calculated when we were working with Cynthia McKinney, that they're spending something in the range of, I think it was $250,000 a minute since the war in Iraq started. And I said, if you took $250,000 every minute since that war started all those years ago, and you funded a well someplace, or a health project, or a community center, or here and abroad, not only would the world be a better place, but we wouldn't have enemies, we'd have friends. The amount of money they spend on trying to contain, and then the violence is just ongoing because it comes from generation after generation is getting the revenge from the shock and the trauma from the years before. So it's kind of an unending cycle. But I think that what we saw with Kennedy then was a rise of that other constituency that came up in large part after World War II in the Southern Rim economy and the development of the aerospace and munitions and oil and land speculation into a whole new money, a nouveau riche. H.L. Hunt was richer than the Rockefellers, but he was nowhere near as savvy of what to do with the money. He used to say, I go east, they treat me like a stable hand. And, but they had big money and they had rising concerns, and they didn't like the old Eastern establishment, and I think in part that it's a shift in the class, and those segments of the class, when they clash, assassination is part of the agenda to move people into ascendancy. It's on March 31, 81, the Washington Post said that it was ironic that Neil Bush, Bush's son, was going to have dinner with Scott Hinckley, Hinckley's older brother, and they said that was ironic and that they had canceled their dinner. And I said, well, is that ironic? I said, if I told you that Robert Oswald was going to have dinner with one of LBJ's daughters on November 22nd, would you think it was ironic? If so, I'm an irony theorist, I think it might mean something, And then you look, and first thing Reagan said when he woke up, in the hospital, he said, get me the demographics on that kid who shot him. Well, you get the demographics on that kid, and you're finding two families that are financially and socially linked, the Bushes and the Hinckleys, for many, many years. And the Bushes bailed out the Hinckleys oil companies, and Scott had relations, with a niece of Bush was making his dating arrangements. The two, Neil and Scott Hinckley, were involved in the oil speculation stuff around the Bushes. So, and Reagan was not in that circle, and Reagan was, to some extent, bucking it. So I think, I've looked at all the assassinations, not just the ones that are, fascinating because they loved Kennedy or, but I've looked at all the different ones, and I think it's a part of history. It's a technique of history. It was started out as the attentat by the nihilists in Russia, as the way to, if you chopped off the head of the state, then the people would rise. Well, then that was first opposed, then it was penetrated by the intelligence forces of the state, then they thought this isn't such a bad thing, and they started using it themselves or using it against other groups, or you have COINTELPRO pitting their enemies against each other and getting them to kill each other or kill themselves if they can, until it becomes an instrument of social policy and change, and it influences things. So, but COPA, we founded in 1994, with some of the major groups that existed then, some still exist. Bill Kelly and I had the Committee for an Open Archives because we thought the next step in the case was to get the files loose. Just the way I think that's the next step in the 9/11 case, because we've got a report that's worse than the Warren report. the Warren Report at least released 26 volumes and 8,000 pages of evidence that you could compare to the report conclusions. The 9/11 Commission report has over 100 pages in the back in 6-point type of all kind of interviews, and outside of maybe 1% that's public documents, all of that was locked up by them at the end. So they didn't release a single supporting document. It's sort of like, here's our conclusion, trust us. You say, like, well, that's what the guy said in the interview, but I can't read the interview, you know. I can't see what else he said. I can't do any comparisons. So without even that basic stuff, and then, you know, we had been petitioning him right to the end to release stuff, and Hamilton, Lee Hamilton, the vice chair, said, well, you're going to get monographs. And I went and looked up what the hell is a monograph. You know, well, it's a summary. And I said, I don't want summaries, I want the evidence. You know, well, what he meant by monographs were the staff sections. They had like 9 different investigative staffs, and they made reports to the commission, just like there were 5 investigative staffs on the Warren Commission that made reports. And it was interesting when I went in the documents in the 60s that those 5 investigative groups, when they saw the Warren Commission report, they wrote internal memos saying, what's the basis of this conclusion? How's he reached this? Because the investigative staffs didn't write the report. They brought 2 guys in from the Pentagon, from the Army Historical Division. One was Arthur Goldberger, who's still there, just now retiring at age 92. And he just wrote, he not only wrote the Warren report, he just wrote the official DOD history on the attack on the Pentagon on 9/11.
What's his name?
Arthur Goldberger. And the other guy that came over had been planted surreptitiously in the Army Historical Division by the intelligence staff of General MacArthur, and his name was Rudolph Otto Winokur, and he was one of several historians that were planted there that were brought back by Kurt Wiedenbach, or Charles Willoughby was the name he used, that was MacArthur's chief of intelligence. And they were official historians for Hitler, for the Reich. And 6 of them were planted in the Army Historical Division, hid their Nazi past. And so we have an official Reich historian writing the Warren report. And this report was basically crafted by a guy, the 9/11 report, by a guy named Timothy Naftali, who was hired out to propose the thesis of an intelligence failure. And he and Philip Zelikow, the director, and Ernst May worked at the Miller Center. They had all done CIA contract work prior to this, and you know, they decided to write this narrative, but the narrative has no basis. Well, interestingly enough, when they did finally release 2 of the monographs, meaning staff reports, at the time of the release of the report, they put a cover page on them, signed by Zelikow, the director, saying, the commission has looked at these reports in both their public and classified forms, and we have drawn from these reports for our final report. But these are not official documents of the 9/11 Commission. So there's an official disclaimer on their own investigative staff report, which indicates to me that, like in the Warren Commission, they had internal division about it. And then I said, well, what about the rest? And a year later, they finally released the one on, the first 2 were on terrorist financing, terrorist travel. They finally, a year later, released the one on the NORAD, FAA, and that came up with a 7th timeline for what happened that morning. You have an FAA timeline, you have a NORAD timeline, you have 2 or 3 NORAD timelines in their testimony, and then official ones, you know, that were released at the hearings, and a different one in the report, so nothing agrees, including the staff report. And then I said to Hamilton, well, what about the other 6? And he said, that's all you're getting. Now, we were pushing them because they had the power under the congressional rule to lock this stuff up for 30 to 50 years, like they did the House Select Committee volume stuff. And so there, and the JFK Act got the JFK stuff loose, but all the Martin Luther King stuff is still locked up under that till 2028. So we said, you know, why don't you release this stuff when you finish your work? They didn't do that, but they set a date to release it in 4.5 years after they finished their work. And I said, why is such a 4.5? I mean, why don't you just say 5, or, you know, an even figure? I mean, and here's the date that it's supposed to be released. January the 2nd, 2008. You know who's president on January 2nd, 2008? Or 2009, I'm sorry, not 2009. Bush. It's in his waning days of office. He goes to like the 15th or the 20th, and then he's out of office. So he can reverse it. No political cost to him, and no one will remember that they threw that softball right to him. Now there has been, and I've been tracking it at the archives, they approached all the stakeholders, meaning all these agencies that hold the records, and just a preliminary and saying, can you get to work trying to, release these files? Only one agency, the FBI, went through thousands of pages in the particular record batch they sent them, and they approved release of like 200 or 300 pages. All the other agencies didn't cooperate, and the CIA said, we can't release any of it, it's too recent. Well, go look at the Freedom of Information Act or anything else about classification. Too recent is not most of this stuff was not classified in the first place. I mean, the vast majority are non-classified items that they've locked up even tighter than the classified items. Because if I know that there's something in there from the CIA, I can at least go to the CIA and get a mandatory review. But if it's just an interview that they took or something that wasn't classified, I don't have any basis on which to even challenge it. We did, through the National Security Archives, a Freedom of Information Act on each one of the government documents that's listed at the back, and they denied every single one, hundreds and hundreds of them they won't release. But this interim report that was from the summer this year was saying that basically they're not even in the agencies ready to release this stuff in January. And I'm trying to get an update out of Tilly on it. But one of the reasons that COPA started was to implement the JFK Records Act. And it has been one of the two most successful record acts and releases of classified documents in history. By the time the review board finished, an independent review board instead of the agencies deciding, because from 64 to 94, we were using FOIA and usually having to go to court, we got maybe 10 to 15,000 pages on the JFK assassination during that 30-year period. When the review board finally came into existence in 94 and finished in 98, by the time it was done, we had 4.5 million pages out. But it also has a machinery to keep releasing and keep reviewing, so now we're up to 6.5 million pages. And it ends in 2017 when all that's left that's postponed will be released. The only thing comparable, and again with an independent board making the decision, is the Nazi War Crimes Records Act, which has 8.5 million pages. But part of the reason that I think we have to do this work is to reclaim our history. When your history can be stolen or buried, you're a conquered people. And the national security state had an interest starting in 47, initially for war classification, which has some legitimacy, but it expanded into now, last year, 15.5 million records. I'm not talking pages. I mean, multiply by 10 at least on the average, but 15.5 million records were classified anew. Bush has people going through the archive reclassifying previously declassified records. There's been 1 million of those put back under classification. And they're in a secrecy mode that, all the agencies that are concerned about government secrecy, they've never seen anything like it, how secret they are, refusing to testify, refusing to release anything to Congress even. They're hiding basically everything. And so it's, it's a small dent in terms of what they're currently still classifying. But what that means is that they've made our history into a commodity of the national security state. And so part of the dynamic of what I try to keep COPA going is to reclaim our history and to promote transparency, because only with transparency can you have accountability. You can't have democracy without a flow of information. Otherwise, you're making decisions in the blind. It's just a farce, Madison said. And Jefferson said, given a choice between a newspaper without a government or a government without a newspaper, he would always choose the latter. I said in one lecture he never read the Washington Post. But but the idea was that information flow is more critical to democracy's working than the machinery which you put in place to carry them out. So the government's not as important as the flow of information. And so it's a basic principle, and I always quote Martin Schatz, an early critic, who wrote to Vince Salandri years ago that the political paralysis in America is based on the fact that we're allowed to believe anything but to know nothing. And when you can't know, you cannot act. And so, and then of course beyond that, history having its claims as well, we are seeking justice, and we are seeking a society where you would have a real investigation in a murder, of the guy on the street as well as the president, and where you'd have a system of law. And of course, nothing's perfect, but the idea, I think, is that we try to push always for something that goes a little further. And And then I was thinking also this weekend that, we complain about the Warren Commission, we complain about the LAPD investigation, we complain about, the intelligence agencies and what are they doing in secret. And, but in the end, all those institutions are our institutions. Whether we want to think they're ours or not, they are. The Pentagon is our institution. It's our army, our military, And some people, when I'm critical of the military, what it does, they say, like, well, you just don't want any military at all. Well, yes, I would like to live in a world without the war and military, but to say that we have to have a military doesn't mean we have to have this military. Right. Or that we have to have a CIA doesn't mean we have to have this CIA. Okay? So, there's ways to carry on these functions that are healthier for a democracy, and we need to build that critique. We need to start that movement to build a critique, to have every institution in the society reflect the best of the democratic values of the society. So that's part of what we fight for. And then I think that the truth itself does set you free. I think the truth, when you get to it, liberates many things and moves many things in a positive direction. And a lot of people stare at me when I say it, but I wrote a little hip-hop song. And I've done it in the high schools and some other places. And it's based on the word satyagraha, which was a Hindu term that Mahatma Gandhi came up with to describe the power of truth to overcome the power of violence, or truth power, truth force. And so I call this satyagraha hip-hop. Now, I know you think you're tough, but you better keep your distance if you're dealing with a brother who knows nonviolent resistance. Dr. King, he had more power in his one little finger than whatever you'll let loose pulling on that trigger. You be bragging about your juice, dissing everybody, laughing, ha-ha. You won't be smiling long, you run into satyagraha. Now, I really don't think that you're getting the whole picture, but you'll see it soon enough. I have to get nonviolent with you. Violence, get back violence every minute, every hour, but that cycle going to end when it come up against truth power. So that's my little hip-hop. But I'm working on the moves. But we've got more stuff coming up. We have the thing in Washington, D.C., the commemoration on June the 10th. Dallas this year will be from the 21st to the 23rd with a moment of silence on the grassy knoll. If we don't have loudspeakers there doing something else, it will be silent at least. We have a little competing group out in Dallas that doesn't like us. So, and then in October, from the 3rd to the 5th, Cyril Wecht at Duquesne University is going to do Making Sense of the 60s, a national symposium on assassinations, and have a number of leading. He's got Bodden, Jim DiEugenio, Isaac Ferris Jr. from the King Center, Robert Joling, you'll be there, and so Robert Blair Kaiser, Dan Moldea, not quite sure why they invited him, Lisa Pease, William Pepper, David Talbot, and Robert Tannenbaum. So, pardon my editorial comment. I got a little too close to Dan Moldea a few times and know what he's about. But he wormed his way onto a panel one time on the JFK film with me, and at the end, after I had made some connections, and he leaned over and he said, "Where do you get that stuff, John?" I said, "It's called research, Dan." But I also think that in a sense, part of the reason that I've done this work is that and I did work on Jonestown, I did work on the Reagan shooting, I'm doing work on 9/11, although I'm not connected with 9/11 Truth, but these are moments of consciousness and change and paradigm shifts in the society. You've already got your foot in the door to talk about them, because anybody that was old enough, I mean, they even bring amnesia patients back, if they're old enough, starting with what were you doing when Kennedy was killed. They can remember that, and then it starts to unravel. So anybody that was alive during these major incidents and, 5 years or older remembers them. So it's like the vacuum cleaner salesman, you got your foot in the door and you throw the dirt in on the floor, and then you can get in with the vacuum. So you've got an opening to talk about something. It's a common frame of reference, and in that sense, I think that what I'm trying to do with the evidence and with looking at the paradigm in a different way is what the Zen masters do with what they call the koan, or the puzzle that you can't answer. Your particular frame of reference or paradigm won't accept the question, but you can't deny the question because the master's asking it of you, and so you have to somehow, figure it out and jump out of the box. And when you jump out of the box, there's some chance that you can actually get to enlightenment before you get stuck in the next box. So it's a kind of a Western Zen that I think these things allow us to wake up consciousness. Although I don't think that's all we have to do with it, because I think we have to put it in a proper historical context. And unfortunately, I think that we're increasingly post-literate, increasingly post-historical, becoming post-scientific, and even post-logical. And so it's harder and harder. I mean, people get a lot further with a video that says something because people think they've seen it with their own eyes, which is what a magician does. It tells you you're seeing one thing when you're actually seeing another. And so, it's like I had all these people come up to me in Denver at this conference because Bill Cooper had showed this grainy old copy of the Zapruder film in which he points at, there's the gun, and he says that the driver shot around and, turned around and shot the president with this gun, and this piece of light that's kind of shaped like a gun on Kellerman's head in one frame, and he says, there's the gun, And so all these people went, did you see that film where the driver shoots the president? I said, no, there is no such film, and there's no gun, and, but because they saw it themselves, they believe it even better than the evidence. I said, let's just think about it a minute. I mean, you want to kill the president, so here's your plan. In front of the Secret Service, in front of the crowd and the Kennedys and the Connollys, you have the driver turn around and shoot him. Nobody will notice that, I guess a plan. I said, there's another small problem. The driver's over there, Kennedy's here. There's no hole on this side of Kennedy's head, and Kennedy goes back in that direction. So, finally one guy ran by me at the end of the conference and he said, well, Greer shot, but he missed. I said, have it your way. Some people just can't give it up. When I did the work on Jonestown, I found that there was no cyanide pathology in the bodies. It has a very specific cholinesterase pathology. It blocks signals from even the back brain to the muscles. You start getting muscle spasms where they turn on and off. You can't get your breath, and all of a sudden you're gasping for breath. Normally you're going to have arching of the back, spasming and spasming of the arms and the limbs, and going in this distorted position, and then there's this telling cyanide rictus. Am I getting this right? Go look at any picture of Jonestown bodies and tell me if they look like they died from drinking cyanide. They died, according to Dr. Mutu, who was there at the time, and I picked this up in Reader's Digest, Doctors of Death, in '79, and that's how I got started on it, outside of that I knew that they weren't doing the math right, because they said that, they said the first day 408 had died, then 5 days later it was 915, and then they said that bodies had been on top of bodies, and I subtracted 408 from 915, and I said, wait, how can 408 cover up 500?
You're doing your mother's work.
I know, I am. I get my little calculator out. So the mathematics didn't make any sense to me. And the original headline in the New York Times said, 400 dead, 700 flee into the jungle. And that's actually what happened. And over those days, British Black Watch troops and some Green Berets that arrived later killed people and brought them back, dragged them back. So what Mutu found in the 408 bodies was forced injection or strangulation or gunshot. And he testified to the Guyanese grand jury to that effect. And the Guyanese grand jury ruled that there was not a single suicide at Jonestown. So something was injected into them. I don't know what poison it was. They died in calm repose, and many of them are in rows. They've been dragged and repositioned from bringing them in out of the jungle. And a lot of those have the gunshot wounds, and so I can see those in some of the photos. But
what was the motive to kill these people?
I think they were covering up what they were doing at Jonestown, which was a massive mind control experiment, MK Ultra, on a mass level. And they had been trying since 1900 to bring labor back into that area. The Orinoco River Valley is one of the most mineral-rich areas in the world. There's uranium, gold, copper, manganese, all of the infrastructure, the Port Kaituma Airport, the little docks that they used, those were built by Union Carbide for bauxite mining in the 50s. But they can't get the population to go back there because everybody wants to live out in the ocean, the shore, and not back in the hot jungle. And so from 1909 on, they've been trying to, even to today, they've been trying to, after Jonestown was gone, they brought other people back in there. But they were doing an experiment to see if they could basically get slave labor back there. And Leo Ryan broke the secrecy, and then the whole thing imploded, but I don't think they wanted anybody to know what they'd been doing. And they had thousands of drugs there. They had enough psychiatric drugs for the population of Georgetown, over 100,000 people, and had 1,100 people at the site. But everything added to 1,100 up to that point, and then we end up with 915 as the final body count. So there was a strata of people that were able to come and go from the camp, and the rest were kept there. But it's too long to get into, but I just want to make this point that here was this scientific evidence. Mutu came and presented it. The American College of Medical Examiners wrote a critical letter to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology because they flew down there, AFIP flew down there, and they said, oh, we couldn't do a simple fluid autopsy on the bodies because we forgot to bring our medical kits. What are they? They're the Institute of Pathology. I mean, oh, forgot my bag. Gosh, could have had a V8. And so they wrote an open letter of criticism. But John Leo got wind of what I was doing on Time magazine, and he called me up and he said, Mr. Judge, I hear that you believe that the people in Jonestown were murdered. They didn't commit suicide. I said, it doesn't matter what I believe, Mr. Leo. That was the ruling of Dr. Mutu, who looked at the bodies, and it was the ruling of the Guyanese grand jury. I said what they had was bent needles, forced injection marks with some poison, not cyanide pathology. There's this long pause, and then he says, well, but couldn't they have injected each other? And it's like, when you're in the paradigm, you can't get out of the paradigm. You've got to keep going, no matter what, oh, there was a shot from the front. Well, maybe it was two lone nuts who came to shoot him on the same day, So that's always a problem. But I mean, that's part of the work I think that we do.
Were there Jonestown survivors?
Yes, there were. They said officially 16, but I'm telling you, there were 800 adults and 300 children, and they had 800 passports. The People's Temple gave the numbers 1,100. The New York Times said 400 dead, 700 fleeing the jungle. That's 1,100. But you have 915 as the final count. So yes, absolutely, there were survivors, but many of them were part of this basketball team, as they called it, that could come and go, and then they moved on into other operations. Some of them were trained killers, and they moved into Guyana, they went, a contingent of them went to Grenada, but they moved into other South American countries as well. And that, even, I found in 1936 that Adolf Eichmann and his superior Otto von Bolschwing, who was the head of the Hebrew desk in Nazi Germany, had actually repatriated or expatriated 50 Jewish families to Matthews Ridge, to the scene of Jonestown in the 30s, to see if they could move the Jews someplace else. But it didn't work out, jungle conditions and everything, and so they abandoned the plan. But they moved the Laotian Hmong people in there, the ones that worked with the CIA on the opium, and they're still trying to get workforces back in there somehow, but nobody wants to do it. But I'm just giving you those as examples, but I think trying to break consciousness open, and even if on the individual level what you're doing is just medical work or the audio work, and this may not be your ultimate goal in your head, that's what this kind of information, if it can't be denied, if it's scientific, then something's got to change, Yeah.
You're in a DVD called Evidence of Revision, and I wonder if that's
Not with my permission.
I wonder if that was a DVD that you would recommend to people.
I think the guy pulled, I think it's Victor Thorne that did that, and I watched part of it. It's long, it's like 5 or 6 DVDs, but I think he pulled together some good information, and I think he has me in there in the Jonestown section. He's quoting me or something, but I don't know if I'm in some of the other sections, but it's about all different political assassinations, 9/11. It's not terrible, but I mean, it's got, it's a compilation of information, so people should look at it. I mean, certainly researchers should look at it, but so COPA has been operating. I wrote a email out this year called COPA's shoestrings, but I really should have said COPA's socks, maybe. Maybe COPA's bleeding soles of my feet, but we don't have a lot of resources. We get by. I mean, this year's been winging a prayer. So I talked somebody into putting my airfare onto their credit card. I get to the city, I collect the gate, and I see if the hotel's going to arrest me on the way out. But this was successful. We're going to get out of here with actually some money to go into Dallas. But if people are feeling generous to make donations, they aren't tax deductible. We're a 501c4, not a C3. So we are a nonprofit, but you don't get a tax deduction by donating to us. But you get the satisfaction of knowing that we're doing these conferences, and we try to bring the best information forward, not just speculation and things. And we're a research community. That's how we see ourselves. So we're researchers talking to other researchers. But this weekend, I mean, I think from everybody I've talked to, it's just been so information-packed and such great synergy, that happens from it. But I hope we all keep working together. And, I didn't tell Paul, but Cynthia McKinney wants to promote you guys here with a larger audience and see if they can build a political support base for the case and raise money, and so I'm going to put you in touch. But she wants to help out with that. But all of us can do things. It's not a hopeless situation. I've been working in Congress with some success on the Martin Luther King Records Act, and one of the co-signers when I drafted for Cynthia is now the head of the Information Policy and National Archives Subcommittee, so Lucian Clay out of Missouri, so he's interested in getting it back up and going. And I've been working with Open Government, and I went to the Sunshine Week. But I said, in light of how many documents are being classified all the time and how little use the FOIA is against them, that their efforts, which were commendable, to get some changes in the FOIA and put some teeth into it. But I said, basically, you're plugging holes in a rusty bucket with which you're attempting to drain a spring-fed lake. And unless we get another mechanism, and the JFK model is the best to date, we can't get at our own history. We can't, and even when we get the files loose, they generally don't tell us everything. But what's missing tells us something, and And over the years, it's funny too, because there were records that were released under FOIA on JFK that were redacted, and then they were released later in a redacted form by the review board, but you could take the two documents, put them side by side, and read the whole thing. Because the reasons for redaction and whose ass is being covered change over time. So, it's our history, and so much of it is buried. I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen Indiana Jones, but the new one, they start off in this subterranean warehouse where they had the Ark of the Covenant goes in at the end of the last movie. Well, in Suitland, Maryland, not far from my house, is the National Records Center archive for military records alone since the end of World War II. And it's in underground buildings, and they're an acre in size, and there are 27 of them. 27 acres of literally buried history, just military history since the end of World War II in that one archive. So much of it has, slipped away from us that we need to reclaim. But I said, come the revolution, look for me at the archives. That's the door I'm going to be breaking down. But, I really appreciate all the people, and people have come here from out of town for this, and we got a crowd because of KPFK, and Paul Nara and Summer Reese, Aaron Landry did the technical stuff. Carl Chatsky, my friend, came and helped us out with it. And I don't want to leave anybody out, but I mean, we have people every year that help us. But we're small. We're not big fish, but we try to do the best job. And then we record it and we get it out. So I'm thinking, since this was an anniversary year, maybe we'll have a DVD that'll have all 5 events on it. Yeah, and Mike Nurko helps out too. He takes the money, so I trust him. Important, yeah. And he came all the way from New York, and he comes to almost, you make every COPA conference, just about, don't you? Yeah, so he's been a great help over the years. Tom Lyons, we couldn't be here without Tom Lyons.
You talk about Eisenhower fomenting these genocides in Africa. Yeah, he's sort of emerged as the hero of the counterculture with a big warning about the military-industrial complex. And he was so horrified when he saw the concentration camps, and he wanted to make sure all the Germans saw them. How could a man with this level of what would be the split? He seems to have a certain level of conscience.
Yeah.
He's not George Bush.
No, he's got some amazing quotes saying that every warplane is, taking bread away from a plate, and it's like.
But at the same time, he seems to have no compunction of going into Africa.
Well, I don't know if he had no compunction. I mean, I think you got to put it. I don't think Eisenhower originated those plans. I think Bissell and the CIA boys did. But you have to understand. I think that those people are under certain pressures, and the ones Kennedy had the gall, and the intelligence to buck them. But when you buck them, they don't like it. And so he may have understood all that. He waited till he got out of office to, on his way out the door, he made the warning, not while he was in there. And, I think it's like Lisa said last night, well, you say what you got to say to get into the office. And I said, well, saying what Obama's saying is not just to get into the office. It's like if he gets in there and says, oh, I changed my mind, But it is interesting that he told the DNC not to take any more lobby money. That's pretty, that's pretty cheeky. But I just put it in its context, and I don't know. The documents are from his administration. Did he sign off on them? I don't happen to believe that the Kennedys approved of trying to kill Castro. A lot of people blame them with it, but I think those plots were developed, outside of their cognition, and then Bobby was sent in really into Mongoose to stop them. And they stopped raids, and they were opposing the thing. So I don't know even if it happens under your watch whether you absolutely know about it.
You think Eisenhower knew immediately that on November 22nd that they were trying to, arrest the citizen or had that hard time?
Well, he knew Nixon. Maybe he figured it out. I don't know. It took Nixon 13 years to remember where he'd been in Dallas that day. There's a couple of them, I say they get the amnesiacs back, but I'm always suspicious of the top-level people who say they don't remember where they were on November 22nd, And he was one, Richard Helms, I think, said he didn't know where he was, and he was at the swimming pool with Bobby when Hoover called to tell him the brother had been shot, like a ear listening, and E. Howard Hunt always said he didn't know where he was. Well, he said he was, later he may have a story, he's at home watching TV and Chinese food, but his kids, I happen to know some friends of his kids that went to school with him, and they said he wasn't home that day, and they were asking him, what were you doing November 22nd? So, there's 3 or 4 of them that have a faulty memory, but Nixon was in Dallas, and he didn't recall that he'd been in Dallas and flown out that day till much later. So, but I would think people at that level at least have the suspicion. I don't think it took too long for the Kennedys to figure it out, and I think Bobby and that they did their own investigation and hired people to find out, but because they had their enemies. But people on that level also don't share everything with the rest of us, and they have their rationale. So I wouldn't take it away from Eisenhower. That he had a conscience and he had some thoughts about that, and I don't know for sure how much of that he understood that he was signing off on, or what it was about, or how it was presented to him. I think, and what pressures were put on him to do it.
I see, yeah.
So I think Paul's going to call and see if we can get over to Ted, but if we can't, we do have the equipment here that we could project Second Gun. But I don't know how many of you have seen Second Gun. I don't, maybe I can get a count on that. Most of you have, I'm sure. Yeah. But if everybody's seen it, maybe there's not a reason to show it. But I was glad he came. I teased him one time, because he would always come to the conferences and he'd say, I am the father of this case. And he'd always demand extra time, and I have to speak first and the longest. I'm the father of this case. And I said, Ted, you got to get a paternity test. But he called me this year and he said, the results are in on the pregnancy. I'm the father. So I haven't seen the actual proof, but but he is, in terms of being the first one out there to ask these questions and putting a lot of the early stuff together. And he was telling me last night that one of my mentors was Mae Brussel, and she gave him a lot of support and help, with what he was doing. So, he was still thankful to her, and he. Obviously, these are often group efforts, and a lot of people put in things, and we kind of sort, but he was courageous. He was a journalist. He was there on the scene, and he went after the story. And as he got into the story, a lot of the things that we're talking about now, he laid a foundation, and that came out this weekend. That people looked to him, and I.
Took me an hour to convince him to come on Saturday.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought he wanted to be here. But.
I think he wanted to be. He wanted a special invitation.
Oh, well. I'll print one up. But you know, we can't pay honoraria, we can't pay, you know, flights and everything else. Everybody comes at their own grace to COPA, but you're coming into the people who want to know the truth about this and the people that do the work about this, and so that's it really came out of the old ASK conferences. There was a group called South by Southwest, and they were a rock promotion group. And somebody in Dallas asked them to organize JFK conferences, which they did, but they charged like $150, $200 per person. They wouldn't let anyone record anything. They recorded and came out and sold it to you. You know, if you lost your conference booklet, they wanted $5 to replace it. You know, if you lost your badge, they wanted $150. Like, what, you don't have a record there that I paid? You know, they were just, we were coming out there on our own steam. We were the monkeys on the organ grinder. They were taking, you know, thousands of dollars in income, and they'd go home with it, and, you know, we'd all go back still broke. So I said, well, why are we doing this? Why don't we just organize our own conferences? So that really came out of the last ASK conferences. We started COPA in '94.
John, these two guys have done fantastic work.
Well, they certainly have.
For many, many years. Pulls together all the stuff that we developed back in the early days. And information is, as William Turner said, you know, it's a tipping point in this case, and probably puts us ahead of the other two cases. Based upon your experience and what do we do now with it? You know, we're trying to develop a political strategy. You got a hell of a leader in the city council who will do anything, because he was very close to Robert Kennedy. And it looks like we're going to get one of the best conservative law firms in the city working with us. What's our legal strategy? What's our political strategy?
Well, I don't know that I'm the best person to determine that, you know, because you're in a different state than I am. I do think that you would have friends in Congress, but I think also, you know, if you open a congressional investigation, it gets politicized immediately. But I think you have friends in Congress that could help you promote the stuff, you know. I don't know if what route you're thinking of going. I think Bill Pepper wants to do a civil suit, and that may be a way to get all the information out. But as you know, the amazing information from the civil suit in Memphis, nobody covered it. I mean, Jim Douglas and one woman from Brazil were the only reporters there, and it was abysmal. So I mean, you know, but I think this is a little harder to block. And it's very clear to me from the kind of press attention we got by saying we have new evidence in the Robert Kennedy case that you've got your news hook if you know how to play it right. I mean, I would get somebody who's professional at PR stuff and, you know, start with that, to somebody to handle your news outreach on the case. And, you know, I think that maybe it's worth trying to go back to a grand jury approach. I don't know, but I mean, I don't know who the DA is. I mean, we're thinking of doing that in the JFK case because we got a new DA in Dallas who's black, who, you know, just released documents, and we're trying to say to him, hey, and I've invited him to the COPA conference, you know, even though we contested where he should put the documents with him, but we did it in a friendly way. So, you know, I mean, a grand jury does at least open it legally. Of course, you got to get a good DA, and I don't know who the DAs are. I mean, all this, whenever you do anything, the details, you know, that's where the devil is. I mean, you know, who you're going to get to actually look at it, what judge you're going to get to consider it, you know. I mean, Ray's case would never reopen without Judge Joe Brown having gotten the luck of the draw, who tested the weapon and that kind of thing. But it's hard for me to say, I mean, you know, what's the best way. I mean, sometimes I feel like you try as many ways as you can, you know, simultaneously even. You know, this is my old take on draft resistance, was that if we'd only had one method of draft resistance, they would have crushed it. But it was because everybody was doing it in so many different ways it finally broke the system down. You know, my favorite draft resistor over all those years, and I knew the political ones and I knew everybody else, was a guy that had exhausted his deferments. He'd already been into and passed a physical. He was going down that day expecting to go into the military. He stayed up all night fretting. And he finally, in the wee hours of the morning before he got on the bus to Cincinnati Station, took a jar of peanut butter down and stuffed peanut butter up at the crack of his rectum. And when you get there, one of the things you do at a physical is you pull your pants down and bend over. The doctor said, "What the hell is that?" And he reached back, took the peanut butter, put it in his mouth, says, "Tastes like shit, Doc." He was out. You got to be creative. I mean, you know. You've got a system that's banked against you, the LAPD and the reputation of the people here, and I don't know. I mean, so many years have passed. How many of those people are still wielding the power? You know, I mean, Jackie Spears just went in. I think she's a possible person to approach. You know, she was shot at Jonestown, and she and Joe Holsinger said some of the stuff I'm saying to you this morning. I mean, they knew it was true. Yeah.
Well, I'd say on the district attorney, I mean, Steve Cooley is as corrupt as they get on small cases. So, I mean, I wouldn't even remote. My mother was a crime victim in '94 when he was head of the San Fernando Valley before he became district attorney, and we've personally dealt with him in boxes of evidence. So, I mean, I wouldn't trust him to, you know, indict a dog. So, I mean,
But
really.
I think on the other hand, you have the same potential that, I mean, Stone reopened the case. You know, the JFK case was basically dead in the water.
Yeah.
And we were trying to get the files loose, and because Stone put a trailer on his film that said the files aren't loose, then millions of people wrote Congress, and then we had the momentum to walk in there and say, we've got to open this up. So, and Mark Sabell was saying last night that the young generation would be interested in this. And so if you can get a medium, you know, a film, a documentary, or something that really gets this out to the public and really start building a public momentum to say this case needs to be looked at again, then sometimes those override the mechanisms that are opposing you. You know, it's probably better to go, you know, on a mass approach like that if you can figure out a good way to build it. And that's why I'm saying talk to the PR people or talk to other people. Like, how's this film going to get distributed? Have a website, you know. Can people have house parties like they do for Move On and show, you know, the stuff. And but try for a grassroots approach and try for an approach that gets it out. The internet is, you know, a whole new. There's all kind of alternative media, and it's a whole new ball game. I mean, in terms of reaching millions of people. I mean, just since we've had a website in the last few days on the blog, and we're getting like 1,500 hits a day on that website, and I'm just like, you know, we're not putting much of a penny into it, but I mean, and there are strategies, you know, that you can reach out and go to YouTube groups and get hundreds of names, you know, people that might be interested in your topic. So get to younger people. They're savvy about this stuff. I'm not as much, but you know, there are people that know how to use and manipulate that web. Or if you could get a group like Eli Parrish and Move On interested, like if Move On wanted to take this up as a topic. I don't know if they would. You know, they're pretty tied to the Democratic Party per se, but you know, if they had the integrity or the interest or it caught them, you know, they've got millions and millions of people that they email to. But there are other email nets and things like that. But I think getting a public momentum behind the case would be important. And, you know, I mean, this didn't get to everybody, but it's going to get around. And if Cynthia and other people here in LA really want to push it, I mean, they can put you on a wider agenda. I would say try to keep it to the topic, because a lot of people are going to try and glom onto the topic or use it for their purposes or claim it and that kind of thing. And I would just say stay independent, stick with the scientific stuff.
Well, this is one of the things that concerns me. You know, I've been working with Bill Pepper on his case on a parallel course. What concerns me about that is if we expect to get support from the Kennedy family, which I think would be crucial in this, if one of the younger members said, you know, this has got to be done. It's not going to be done on the basis of deprogramming Sirhan. We can't relate to that in terms of getting Kennedy family support. Mm-hmm. I think what Bill is doing is excellent work, and we're working with him, and I plan to appear with him in any of his court activities. But the thing that really decided where I decided to really go after the Kennedy family on this is Ted took the position, you know, covered us during the 70s. 75, he made a statement. If there are questions about the assassination of Robert Kennedy, they ought to be answered in the appropriate venue.
He did the same with the JFK Act. He supported the release of the records.
And then I found out recently that when he ran for president, he was a target. And the Secret Service had him in a bulletproof car, bulletproof vest at all times, because there were serious problems. Here's the third guy, you know, get the third brother. And not only that he was running for president, but he's a target. And I think the David Talbot book impressed me with the number of activities that Bob Kennedy was going through in order to prove the case of his brother.
Yeah.
Now, in Los Angeles, March 25th, for the first time he publicly, after being, there were student demands at San Fernando Valley College. What about the Warren Commission report? What about the archives? For the first time, he came out publicly and said, you know, at the appropriate time, the archives will be released, which got great applause. Frank Mankiewicz, his press secretary, who was there, who knew what Bob was trying to do privately, said this is the first time he ever said, you know, and stunned him, first time he ever said it publicly. Now, in the Talbot book, other people have made statements where Bob said to them what he planned to do.
Yeah.
I think that Walter Sheridan was his key investigator of the McClellan Committee and doing all kinds of work. Sheridan's now dead. His wife, in the book, said that Bob and Walter went back to the Justice Department to check the archives after Bob had left the Attorney General's spot. And at one point she said, they never told me, you know, Walter never told me what they were dealing with because he wanted to protect our family, because he felt the family was threatened. But she then said, I think they cracked the case. Now, that's pretty powerful stuff, and it's buried in the Talbot book.
Yeah.
But I want to bring this up with the family and say,
Yeah.
look, this is what your father was doing. Why aren't you doing something now? So,
Well, I think the family feared, and rightly so, because I've tracked other instances where I think that these same forces went after the children. You know, to be protective. I know Jackie didn't want John to run for office, you know, and he was making that decision after her death, and people were approaching him, and he was thinking about it, and he said, Hillary took my seat, you know, in New York, which would have been the stepping stone. And then he goes down in this plane crash on the anniversary night of Chappaquiddick off of Martha's Vineyard, you know, you know, and you know, there's stuff about that. But I think the children, you can't blame them for trying to protect themselves because they were constantly threatened, you know, and it's. But on the other hand, I mean, they ought to look at the legacy of the strength of what the father was doing, and at least some of them. I mean, Robert Jr., I don't know where he's at, but I mean, he's good on other issues. But people that I knew that tried in the research community, that used to try to talk to them, because Bill Kelly used to go skiing with the one guy that lost a leg, you know, and he just, whenever that topic came up, they just said, we don't talk about that.
well, RFK Jr. has already declared his interest in the Senate seat in New York.
Mhm.
This is now being blocked.
Mm-hmm.
But he's expressed that interest. But he should know.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that, I think they know, but I mean, I think they were also, from when they were very young, told, stay away from this, because the family was afraid. I mean, I think that that's the reason. One of the few things in the JFK Records Act that was exempted were the the shirt and the physical evidence that the Kennedy family controlled under Burke Marshall, and that was exempted as deed of gift. Well, I think that the Kennedys grabbed that stuff right at the beginning as insurance. That, you know, we have the real goods on you, just stay away from us, you know, and that's why they still control it. But you know, I can't fault them. And then there's also the fact how high they are up in the money in those circles. Do they really want to air their laundry in front of us? You know, because there's dirt in the Kennedy family too. If you want to start digging, I mean, not more in the Joe's era, but you know, the father. But politics is a strange game. I mean, you know, but I hope you can get their support. I mean, I think it would be critical. I mean, that was my first thought, you know, years ago when I saw the 17-minute ovation, standing ovation for Bobby at the Democratic National Convention. If at that point Bobby Kennedy had said, this report on my brother's death is wrong. There's something wrong here. The whole country would have come up because, I mean, just a thing in the Stone film and, you know, all those years later getting that kind of response. So I think you could capture the public imagination if you can get a few credible people. And of course, the Kennedys are the most credible, but, you know, just people involved to say, AIDS, whatever, to say was never properly resolved, you're going to get a groundswell.
Isn't the value of Kennedy clothing more or less obviated by the fact that that we have photos of Connolly's coat, and the photos of the bullet holes in Connolly's coat disprove the single bullet theory?
Well, I'm just saying they probably didn't have access to Connolly's coat. Connolly's coat went through a kind of strange
But the bullet holes in the coat.
route. You know, it was taken out of the hospital by somebody who was close to Dan Rather, and then it was given to Henry Gonzalez's office, and then his secretary dry cleaned it, which ruined its evidentiary. You know, but
So the bullet holes are still in the coat.
I understand the position of the
It
bullet
shows
holes,
that.
and you can get a picture, but I'm just saying it was very hard. It took years and years and years for even that picture to get out. And all I'm saying is that, you know, rightly or wrongly, I think that they, who knows if they knew anything about the Connolly coat. I just think for their own purposes, they said, we've got this hard evidence and we better keep our hands on it. You know, because it's a way to, you know, but I mean, even the Connolly thing, that's only recent that those photos got out because of the JFK Act.
But one thing is, the New York Times did cover the civil suit with Martin Luther King's murder, and guess where they put the results? Page 11 or 12.
Yeah, well, they had a final coverage, but I mean, there should have been somebody
They
sitting
did.
there. I mean, Court TV should have been there,
They
you know,
hit it. They hit it.
putting it every day.
This should have been front page. I mean, when you have a civil suit.
Oh, of course.
the controversy-
Of course.
Yeah. So they,
In a historical case of that significance, and not to be reporting on it every day, it's more important than the O.J. Simpson trial. You know, but I mean, somebody said, "Do you think O.J. did it?" And I said, "I don't know him. I didn't follow him as a sports figure." I said, "Men beat women and kill women. That happens." I said, "The more important question is how are you treating the women you're with?" You know, because in my neighborhood, in the black neighborhood I live in, Southeast D.C., the T-shirts had a picture of them and it says, "Don't go near the white bitches." And then the other message was, you know, for the black, you know, the white women not to marry the dangerous black men. And they were just playing that whole race thing off of this thing and making an issue out of something that, what business is it of mine what happened between two people, you know. But we live in this celebrity culture where they want us to live everyone else's life instead of our own, and to live vicariously through these celebrities instead of how are we dealing in our own lives through, you know, what we think is right or wrong. It's easier to, I would never do that, you know, or to have an impeachment because, you know, I mean, I want to get a bumper sticker that says, "Where's Monica Lewinsky when we really need her?" You know. Or the more profane version that I saw at the demonstration is, "Would somebody please give him a blowjob so we can impeach him?" You know, I mean, but why is sex the only crime in this society? You murder, you know, genocide. I mean, you know, that doesn't faze anybody. You know, it's just sex. Oh, we had sex. You know, and then they backed off to, well, it's not the sex, it's that he lied about it. He lied under oath. And I said, they all lie under oath. And they look at me and I said, they take the oath of office. So they say they're going to protect the Constitution, you know, right from the start. So, you know, I don't know, but it's a strange culture to try to do things in, and it is celebrity driven. But the New York Times only covered the result to say, you know, then they said, oh, well, the judge was asleep, the jury wasn't paying attention, you know, and to just dismiss this ruling that Ray was innocent and also that the government was involved in the murder. But this maybe, I think, have more potential not to be ignored. I mean, if you could have a civil suit, I think it would. It is a leap, I agree with you, conceptually, to get into the programming issue, although I think it's real. But it's a leap for the public to say, what, they program people to kill people, you know, how could that happen, or how could they make them forget everything, you know? He's just lying, and, you know, that's a second paradigm leap beyond how many guns we're firing. You know, but the gun one is pretty hard and understandable and basic ballistic evidence, and you know, that's to me always the best. I mean, to start with the things that people already understand, you know. Bullet came from the wrong direction because as I did with Reagan, the doctors, I got the doctor's statements, and they said it was a downward 45-degree angle. It was back to front. It was left to right, and so it was opposite of where Hinckley was standing. Also, everybody else is clearly hit with a 38, and for the first 6 hours, they said he was firing a 38. Then it changed to a 22, like the Mannlicher changed. Brady's hit in the head, and most of his brains are gone. Delahanty, a big, beefy black cop, is nicked in the neck. It spins him and drops him to the ground. The Secret Service agent said that bullet hit him in the groin. He was at the back door of the car. It lifted him up and took him to the front bumper, 160 pounds. He said that was no damn 22, and he says that to this day. But the official version is that Hinckley's firing at 22 because Reagan doesn't have hardly any reaction at all. But Reagan's not hit with either a 22 or a 38. Reagan's hit with something so small that it makes a razor cut, and they thought he was having a heart attack for the first half hour. And believe me, at GWU emergency room, they've seen a gunshot wound. All they had was a little black slit, and the nurse said, well, maybe a fragment or something went in there. And then they had to go in the lung 3 times to take it out. I read the medical journal reports and everything else. They almost couldn't find it. They almost closed him up, and they got it the last time. The doctor pulled it out, and he described it as what? Round, flat as a dime, and razor-edged. They have those as weapons. They're flechettes. They're fired. The church committee had one of the guns, and they showed it. Looks like a German Luger. It's got a rifle scope. It can shoot this thing the length of a football field with accuracy. They put 1/10 of a milligram of shellfish toxin in it. It goes into the body without making a slit that the coroner is going to notice. A little razor cut, and it gets into the bloodstream, and in 10 minutes you have a heart attack, or 30 seconds you have a heart attack from the shellfish toxin going in. So that's what they described in open on the church committee, which I said, well, then that's the throwaway stuff, because if they'll show it to you on TV, they must be using something better. But that's how they described this thing that went into him, not as a slug, and there's no chain of custody on the bullets. So, but, you know, you look at that, look at the hard evidence, look at the direction that they say the guy's firing, look at the effect of the weapon on it, look at the wounds. That's what a coroner does. I mean, if you're paying somebody to be a coroner or medical examiner, they better damn well start with the assumption that there's no such thing as a natural death and work backwards if they're going to do their job. You know, because otherwise they're just going to miss it. You know, and you got to be critical or curious about everything, even the most plain thing. And it's not to say that there aren't natural deaths. Of course there are, and more of them, hopefully, than not. But, you know, if all you're going to do is a cursory examination and put the body in the ground, then you're going to miss a lot of homicides. And, you know, everybody deserves the right to at least have them ask the question. You know, so. Somebody else had a question, or? Yeah.
John, you know when Robert Kennedy says on those speeches on the movies yesterday, through the awful grace of God?
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly, awful grace?
I guess you'll have to ask Aeschylus.
Yeah. Does it mean truth, an unpleasant truth? Is that what he's talking about, or something?
Well, generally, theologically, and I don't know how it's translated from the Greek or what Aeschylus thought of as a god or a deity, but generally, I mean, I think that grace is, you know, generally seen as sort of a power that transforms, that, you know, that comes from the divine. I mean, you're asking an atheist. But I often say I'm an agnostic wavering between pantheism and atheism. So either God is everywhere or God is nowhere. So I'm trying to explain this. But I did study theology in school because I wanted to figure out how the saints and the spiritual leaders woke up to consciousness and how they stayed awake. So, but grace is considered to be that transformative power that comes from the divine into your life. And so I think what he's saying is that, you know, over time, even when you're asleep, even when you don't want it to happen, you get transformed either by the pain or by the love. I mean, you know, both things are transformative. And the awful grace of God means you can't do anything about it. I mean, it's awful in the sense that it's, you know, it's there with all of us. It's what hopefully improves us. You know, I think is the theological theme. But it's sort of visited on you whether you want it or not, I guess, in that view. I don't know, does that mean, I mean...
Yeah, it helps. Thank you.
God's awful grace. The sermon today. We're going to talk about God's awful grace. Yeah, but I mean, think about it, how do we all end up here? I mean, you know, It doesn't have to be divine, but we all were transformed by certain historical events and, different levels of consciousness, and so we come together around those things. And
I think awful would have been not awful as in bad, but awful as in awesome,
Yes.
awe-inspiring,
Yeah.
the
Awful.
overwhelming
yeah,
embrace of
AWEFULL, awful.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's the song, Amazing Grace. I was a wretch and I was transformed, by this grace, and it goes on forever. And well, I hope there's some working principle in that direction. I can't posit it. I've only seen angels, beings of light. I haven't run into Mr. Big. Until I do, I don't want to posit him or her or whatever it is, but or Mrs. Big. That's right. Years ago, when I was working for conscientious objectors in Philadelphia, some guys came in off of one of the ships that was in dry dock, and the guy had been reading the Bible, and he'd come up with the idea that Christ was a pacifist. So. We took him in the back room there at CCCO, and for $35 we gave him a conscience. I think that's what those commanders thought. So we told him how to apply as a conscientious objector, and then the next week 6 guys came in, and they had all read the Bible, and they thought Christ was a pacifist, and they wanted to get a conscientious objector discharged too. Well, you can imagine the command, it's going to be Jonestown pretty soon. So the guy actually put a thing up on the bulwarks on the ship, commander, saying that on his ship during duty time no one was allowed to talk about God or conscientious objection. So I wrote him a note, and I said, in my day, to be a conscientious objector, the first question on the draft form is, do you believe in a supreme being, with a yes or a no box, if you can imagine reducing your theology to that point. And if you put no, you weren't likely to get the claim. But I said, now I said, somebody wants to be a conscientious objector, I said, you're not even allowed to talk about her. It used to be you had to believe in God, now you can't talk about her. And I remember one admiral that testified when they had mandatory chapel at Annapolis, and there was a guy there that didn't want to go to mandatory chapel, and he took it to court, and this guy testified that he didn't know a single officer that had risen in the ranks that was an atheist. And probably speaks well to atheists, but I won't go into that. I wrote him a note, and I said, well, gee, they say there's no atheists in foxholes, so if you can't either be an enlisted or an officer, shouldn't it be a grounds for discharge? But pardon my irreverence on a Sunday. I say love is my religion because I think of all the people that, are seen as the heads of religion, that's what they talk about. They talk about love and loving one another, and if you don't love one another, you certainly can't love whatever this divine being is. Say you love God and not your neighbor, you're lying to yourself.
Does that mean you're trying to love George Bush?
Yes, I do try to love George Bush.
We'd like to love
It's
you
rough,
in
but
that office.
yes. I'd love him if he was in a different position. But, I think it's got to be an overall approach because we can't transform half of humanity. We've got to transform all of humanity. So how are we going to do that? Could George Bush, as stupid as he is and as venal as he is, finally get the idea? Possibly. It's not likely given his circumstances, but if I rule it out entirely, then I live in a world that I can't transform. And we've got to transform it because we're at this, I think, a crux of human history right now. And if we keep going down this nightmare path, the planet may survive as a rock, but we won't as a species. And we got some work to do, but we have all the tools, we have all the resources we need for everybody for the planet to survive and be sustained, and for the other species to survive, and all of us to have our basic human needs met. That's not a problem now. Problem is distribution. I've been saying that I wanted to have a reverse lottery because the poor are the only ones that do the lottery, and they don't have the money to do it, and they all waste their money like buying these tickets, hoping that because the rich don't need to do it, So then you get a lottery, and they say, "Oh, I won, $6 million." Well, that means 6 million. One guy wins and 6 million lose. So I want to do a reverse lottery. I want to put all the people that are above a certain level of wealth into a barrel, and you can buy as many tickets as you can afford, and you're guaranteed to win something. And then at the end of the month, you pick out the rich guy out of the barrel, and if it's Bill Gates, you're in really good shape. But if it's some lower level, Mellon, great grandchild, maybe you don't do so well. But you get something. You take that level of wealth, a percentage of it, you divide it up, and then 6 million win, and one guy loses. You know, I think it's much more fair. And then I think if he won't give up the money, you give everybody who bought a ticket, you send them his address. But you know, I have simple solutions for the world. I have a solution for the Middle East, which is a two-state solution, but it's not the one everybody thinks about. You take the Middle East sector where the Palestinians and Israelis live, and you figure out where all the resources are, the water and everything that's valuable, and you draw a line between it and divide it roughly in half. And then you build a huge wall along that line with one gate in it with a metal detector, like a 50-foot wall. And on one side, you have the Israeli military resistors guard the tanks and the nuclear weapons and the planes. And on the other side, you leave all the conventional weapons. Now, the two states are made up. One state is made up of Palestinians and Israelis who are sick of fighting. They go over where the nuclear weapons and everything is. And then you have another state is made up of those who want to continue fighting. I can tell you from the beginning which the larger state will be. But, and then you can also, it's a free country, you can change sides anytime you want, but the metal detector means you can't bring a weapon with you. And then you wait till the side that wants to keep fighting till they get down to the last guy who comes back and he says, I won. Yes, that's great. You pin a medal on him. You let him name the country. You take down the wall and you get back to business. Even the Redskins, which is an issue where I am because Native Americans and other people are offended by the name of our football team in D.C., rightly so, I think, but everybody's wringing their hands, and I said, look, just change your logo. You don't have to change your name, just change your logo to a potato. Solves the problem. The Washington Redskins. So there are ways to influence the world, but yeah, that's right. No one listens to me. I don't know why, but they won't take up my ideas, even though they're just very simple solutions to things. But I know it's tough. I mean, you know, what can I say? It'll work better than two armed states of hostile people next to each other. You know, but yeah, the world doesn't organize itself in that way for several reasons. But like I said, think outside the box. Get your peanut butter out. But I'm honored for the people that came and, you know, our speakers that came on their own juice and helped present. We had wonderful presentations this weekend, and I think we really had a successful conference. I'm going home with money for Dallas, so that's a plus. And, you know, we didn't have the king's accommodations, but we couldn't have afforded them anyway. And we packed the house by having too few chairs. So what else can you do? It was a success, you know. And but I mean, you know, I've been at this since the late '60s, and it's a community that I've always enjoyed being part of. And you know, people say, well, aren't you afraid to do this kind of work? You know, doesn't it bother you? And I said, I'd be more afraid if I couldn't find the truth. That would frighten me. You know, the truth may be awful. It may mean that we have to do things that we don't want to do. But if I absolutely couldn't find out anything, you know, then I would be in a quandary. And you have to have the courage to face the truth, it seems to me, if you're going to live. And you want to say you live in a democracy, that's part of the cost. And if you want to be a human being, it's part of the cost, you know, the unexamined life theme. And, you know, I think, and then they say, well, do you think somebody's tapping your phone? I say, I hope so. Maybe they'll learn something. The guy tapping my phone is so low down on the need-to-know chain that he's getting vertical information. I'm giving him horizontal. That's what I was doing in Dallas. Mae Brussel used to get calls from intelligence agents warning her before somebody was going to try to kill her, because they were the only one telling them the truth, you know. They said, look out for intersections today, you know, and then she just missed the car that was coming after her. So, but she was an incredible person, and we shared information over the years, and I would call her and I'd say, Mae, did you see this? And she'd always say, oh, my aching ass. And she'd laugh, because what can you do about it except laugh? But you know, she was a brilliant person. I don't say she got absolutely everything right, but she had her nose in the right place, and she was ahead of the curve. And she used to say, I shouldn't tell people I'm a researcher. I should tell them I'm a psychic. And then when I predict the assassination, they'll treat me like Gene Dixon. They'll love me, But she did. She passed a note to Rose Kennedy 5 days before Bobby was shot saying the forces that killed John are moving on your son in California. She called Mary Jo Kopechne's parents 3 days before Chappaquiddick and said they're going to kill your daughter. Because she was watching them. She knew who they were. She went 1,800 pages of cross-reference indexing on the Warren Commission until she figured out who did it. And then she tracked those people historically. And she had her weekly radio show. She called it World Watchers. She wanted it to be like Weight Watchers. And she thought of all these housewives would have little coffee clutches and clip the news and send them to her, And then she started putting out the weekly tapes, and so I got a group to listen to the tape every week, and she said, well, you win the fishing prize, because nobody else was doing that. We called ourselves Brussels sprouts. And she liked that. But she broke down the news, and she's 10 years before Reagan went into office. They said they're going to make Reagan president. They would laugh at her, But she said I should have been a psychic. Said I was psychic, and then they loved me. And she'd go out and do the lectures, and all these people would come up and they'd say, oh, May, you do such great work. It's really wonderful. And May would say, what do you do? What do you do? It can't all rest on me or even the women in this room. I mean, we're not going to change society, but all of us burning the candle at both ends forever. We got to try to promote a culture of community, a culture of truth, a culture of connecting to each other, caring about things, of supporting each other. And even more critical now because even the resources that we used to get the crumbs of are drying up. And if there aren't communities based on more trust and other things, we're not going to survive. I mean, the cities are going to get very ugly. They're ugly already for large portions of people, but this system's collapsing in on itself financially in many ways, and so I do my piece. I wrote in a fundraising email recently, when people ask me what I do, I say I don't know where to start. Because I do Coalition on Political Assassinations, I do a 9/11 research project, I do Choices, which goes into the high schools in D.C. and talks to kids before they enlist and lets them talk to veterans and tells them they have alternatives, other ways they can get money for college besides going in the military, and that it may not be their best choice, especially for blacks and women and Hispanics because of the racism. And African American males coming out right now are 4 times as unemployed and 4 times as homeless as kids that don't go in the military in the first place in that same community. Because so many of them come out with bad discharges and they lack skills or they pick up alcohol and drug habits, and so it's not overall veterans are 3 times as unemployed as the rest of the society. And you got a rate of 600% increase in suicides just in the last year among Iraq and Afghani veterans. There were 150,000 Vietnam veteran suicides in the first 6 years after the war ended. Then they cut off the statistics at the VA. And that 600% is not real, because the last briefing I did in Congress was with the Mental Health Assessment Team 3 for the Army. And I said, are you tracking suicides? And they said 3 months out. Well, you don't hit PTSD stress points till 6 months out. So to track them for 3 months out means you're not tracking them. And, so that's one way that they're reducing the statistics. But, I do those projects. I'm trying to build, as I mentioned, a foundation to have a hidden history museum in D.C. that can tell some of the real truth about. Because we get 6 million tourists a year there, and if we can open a door that shows them this stuff and a research center where students can come, we can counter some of the effects of the propaganda and the lies and the deception that the society is built on. So, and I just think it's, whenever I go anywhere, like I went and joined the American Association of Museums, and I'm writing the name Hidden History Museum on the form, and the young woman's reading it upside down. She says, that sounds interesting. And I said, yeah, that's the idea. I told Phil Donahue I want to do it. He said, I'd like to be on the board where they decide what to put in there. And I said, we'll put you on. But it captures the imagination. Hidden history, what are you talking about? What's hidden from us? Everybody wants to know what's hidden. So it's true. I mean, so it's a good catch, a good hook. And if we could get young people out there by the busload, which I think we could do, and really start to make a difference and have an exhibit about Robert Kennedy or, the new evidence always, and new books and new films. We could discuss them. We could have press out there. It's a press hub, and really get something going. So I'm hoping that I can lay the foundation for that. But
John, I think one of the interesting things is actual younger people in their 20s are more interested in, say, I'm in my 30s, but people in their 30s and 40s, people who were either born shortly after these assassinations occurred or were children during them, a lot of them just write it off and go, well, it already happened, why are you even discussing this? Whereas people that are like 15 years younger than I am are like, wow, so what's that stuff you're working on? That's really interesting. So there really is a lot of potential amongst like people who are completely like born post 1980 who are like, wow, that's really something else. And like with none of the sort of programmed inhibition of the society, you know, because people in their 40s that I talk to are like, why are you dealing with that? You know, and I'm like, wow, okay, they've really absorbed like whatever the dominant message was while they were growing up. Whereas people were completely devoid of
Well,
any
the
of
dominant
that.
message was, we can kill the president, we sure as hell kill you, sit down, shut up.
Well, yeah, and also this is the party line. This is the official version of reality, so they just inculcated that version of reality. Whereas younger people, they're like blank slates, and they're like, wow, what are you talking about? That's totally fascinating. Plus, cynicism has increased in the culture dramatically, and so the younger you are, the more cynical you are about absolutely everything.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to believe that everything is completely screwed up and they totally
But
lied
sometimes
to
it
you.
cuts
So.
both ways, and that cynicism says, well, of course the government killed the president.
Exactly.
But what could I do about it?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
And this sort of inculcated sense of powerlessness.
But the YouTube culture, definitely. I mean, really young people do believe in their ability to communicate with each other about
Yes.
issues, and they don't have the inhibitions against discussing these issues. So there's definitely room there, I think.
And I just think tapping into that with a quality message is going to make a difference with
Totally.
actual information and stuff that you can prove, and, you know, and not getting beyond that. Because we don't need the speculation. I mean, the speculation, anybody can speculate about when something happens, but when you can show something that then can be further investigated, it's, you know, where that cracks the thing open and say, I didn't know that, that doesn't fit. And you've got a chance, at least, to get people to ask real questions instead of just jumping to, you know, oh, well, that's what happened, and the government must have done it, and, you know, but who am I, you know, to say anything? But we have a great deal more power than we think, and the government goes to these crazy lengths that it does with mind control and all this crazy stuff because they're afraid of us. You know, to make us afraid of them or afraid of some enemy they give us to be afraid of. I have two post 9/11 metaphors. One is that you come in a field and you see a guy sitting under a tree in a chair, and he's completely wrapped head to toe in duct tape. And he has a large stick, and every once in a while he picks up the stick and he whacks a bee's nest up in a tree, and the bees come out and surround him, and they start stinging him, and he starts yelling, and he's jumping, and he's putting on more tape because they're finding the hole. And then he gets a spray, and he sprays them, and some of them start dying, and finally the bees recede, and they go back up into the thing, and he sits down, and he's catching his breath. So you go up, and he does it a couple of times, and you go up in the interim, and you say, what's going on? And he says, everything was fine around here till these killer bees showed up. He said, all they want to do is sting you. He said, I have to sit here in this hot duct tape. They always find a new hole. I got this spray that's supposed to kill them, but it doesn't kill all of them, and there's always more of them. He said, well, it may have something to do with picking up that stick and whacking the thing in the tree. He said, what's that got to do with it? That's how I get my honey. My other metaphor is that the farmer's out in the field and the fox runs by, and the farmer says, what are you doing out here? You're supposed to be guarding the chickens. The fox says, all right, boss, I'm on my way over there right now. He said, well, wait, how are the chickens? The fox says, the chickens were plump. The chickens were juicy. He said, why are you referring to them in the past tense? He said, oh, didn't we tell you? There was a terrible security breach. He said, we brought the chickens out of the pen into the yard, and no one could have imagined that dogs and eagles and ferrets actually eat live chickens. He said, well, of course they do. He said, what happened? He said, well, most of them are gone. You know, they've all been eaten. He said, that's terrible. He said, I'll probably have to buy more chickens and get a new rooster, hire more foxes. Those are my metaphors for where I live, in the armed camp called D.C., where you can't even see the Capitol because they've got security walls around it, 15 feet high, you know, and you have to have a special pass to get in anywhere that belongs to you, you know. But we don't have so much to be afraid of. 9/11 was a terrible incident, but it was at most a black eye. It wasn't the whole country being attacked and an ongoing war against us. And there's a lot of over-response to this. It could have been handled in an international court. The Taliban offered 3 times to turn bin Laden over to such a court. We just said we don't negotiate with terrorists because we had already planned to go into Afghanistan, and Colin Powell announced it to all the surrounding countries in July that we were going in mid-October to take them out because they were getting in the way of a UNICAL plan to bring a pipeline down from the Caspian Basin to the Gulf. And the company testified in 9/9, they're in the way, you know, that's our oil under their sand, so we got to go in and get rid of them. But
Bin Laden offered a truce, and we weren't very interested.
there's a what?
Remember the one-day truce that Bin Laden offered?
Yes, yes.
Years ago? We didn't really respond to that.
Well, you can't negotiate with a terrorist. Ask the people in the other countries about Bush. You know, but we don't have to be at each other's throats in the world all the time, and you know, we're spending we're almost to the point where we're fighting wars to have enough oil to fight the wars, because the military uses such a large amount of oil, or at least ours does. It's so largely funded, but we could have a different kind of world, I think. Nothing's perfect, but I think opening these cases and opening history itself is key to changing consciousness, changing culture, and those kind of things, and that's why I keep throwing this particular wrench into the machinery of the state, because I think it's one that has to be done, but it also has a great potential for change. And so I would think, yeah, younger people, especially without all those inputs, would be interested.
Yeah, they don't have all the baggage
Right.
of history.
So
They're
like-
completely fresh and ready to accept new information. And
Yeah.
It's kind of wonderful. So it's really a matter of
Right.
figuring out how to,
If-
like you said, you need the tech savvy people to get it out there to them, you know? So,
You need that, but you also need, I mean, discernment and
Yes.
critical thinking on their part, because, you know, otherwise they believe the next thing they hear.
No, but
And,
that cynicism comes into play very nicely, actually, you know, because they're ready to believe that their government is capable of evil because they see the society around them kind of falling apart while everybody's saying everything's fine. So I think there's a lot of potential there to at least continue this search for truth amongst new generations, you know.
Well, that's my perspective, but not everybody's. Hope I haven't offended some people in the room, so. That's a crazy way that I think, but my friend Lenny says I think upside down, so probably do. But you know, I want to live in a sane world. I want to live in a democratic world. I'm not afraid of democratic decisions. I wish that we would do more of them by referendum than by representative. But I do trust the masses. I find a lot of people in the progressives and circles to be elitist, and they just want to grab the controls themselves, and they know what's best for everybody else. And that's not my point of view. You know, and I'm not. Somebody asked me in one of the talk shows, you know, I want to know how Mr. Judge voted in the last election, and I said, well, I didn't vote. That shut him up. You know, they say if you don't vote, you have no right to complain. I said, no, quite the opposite. If you throw your chips into a rigged poker game, you have no right to complain. But I used to have two buttons years ago. One said, don't vote, it only encourages them. And the other one said, if voting worked, it would be illegal. But I would rather vote on issues than candidates, although I work for Cynthia McKinney, and, you know, it's because I respect her as a person, and I think that the possibility of getting a third party with 5% of the vote really opens a different dynamic in this country. She puts it that there's a table of power in a closed room, and only the corporate lobbyists have permission to come in the door. The people can look in through a cloudy window but not really see what's going on, and that puts a third chair at the table. A third party, that there's two chairs there, and she says that if two people are planning something illegal and a third person walks up, they'll shut up and they'll stop planning it. And so it would not only put the third chair at the table, it would open the door out to the public and they would see what's going on in the room. And so that's her metaphor for why you need a third party. But it's just, for me, wanting to change the dynamic of a society where this kind of thing that happened with Robert Kennedy can happen. It shouldn't happen. I mean, it just shouldn't. There's no decency to it. There's no really any logic to it. I mean, there's rationale, but I mean, not social logic to it. And you know, even and as I say, I studied the Reagan assassination. I don't like Reagan, but it matters who killed him and what happened there. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, shot him. I mean, yeah, I'm sorry. Probably also matters who killed him, but yeah, I mean, it matters who tried to kill him. And in the same way, it's not that I'm doing this because I love the Kennedys. You know, it's kind of like I tell people that I'm a vegetarian not because I love animals, but because I hate plants. I see a plant, all I want to do is tear it out of the ground, chop it into pieces, boil it alive, and munch on it. It matters in a society where you want a democracy. You know, you can't let the president or the candidates just be killed willy-nilly and not ask. And the same with King. How can you ask young black people to follow this leader, Dr. King, if you're not going to solve his murder? Because what you're telling them is that, you know, you go out there and you get killed doing it, we're not going to look into your murder either. You know, you can't remember his life and forget his death. You know, you've got to look at both. And you know, and you got to understand, why would they want King dead? Why would they want Malcolm dead? You know, and it's funny because the far leftists like Chomsky and these others, even Coburn, they'll tell you that there was a reason to kill Dr. King. That was a big conspiracy. But then they get to Kennedy, and because they don't like him, they say, you know, well, why would they have killed Kennedy? Kennedy was with them. Kennedy was a ruling class bastard like the rest. And so therefore there couldn't have been a conspiracy. But, you know, you can't do it based on whether you like the guy or not, or whether you think there was a reason. I mean, I think there was plenty of reasons why they wanted to kill John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. And I think we saw some of them here, in the sense of hope that they gave, and that they were bucking the system and making changes that mattered to the big money. And these intelligence agencies that felt they couldn't do what they wanted under them. Kennedy saying he'd scatter the CIA to the four winds, or the oil tax depletion allowance. There are many reasons. But you know, I don't think you can do it on that, just on that basis alone, that, you know, you think you can think for them. You don't analyze the Kennedy assassination from the perspective of whether a leftist thinks he was left enough to be worth killing. You analyze it from the right wing and whether he was left enough for them to think whether he was worth killing. You know, you have to go to the source. You know, and you know, was he a saint? No. Was he as left as all of us wanted to be? No. But what was significant about these people, I think, is that they were responding to and reflecting public movements and movements for change at the time, and giving those movements hope and giving them direction. And because of that, they were worth killing, because they didn't want a black messiah to rise, and they didn't want a president who would respond to the public. You know, and I often say that since Kennedy, there probably hasn't been a president, possibly with the exception of Clinton, that's had enough brains in his head to make it worth blowing him out. But it's a situation where, you know, people, you can't get to motive before you get to what happened. And if you just think in these categories, well, there wouldn't be any reason to kill him because of the way you see him, then you can't get at it. And Chomsky also said that it's fun. Look how all these people put all this time into the Kennedy assassination. They read all these things, but none of them look at the King assassination. I'm like, well, who was the first guy to write a book about the King assassination? Harold Weisberg, who did Whitewash, and then he did Frame Up. Okay, so I mean, we've written about and talk about the King assassination and Malcolm and, you know, the others. We're not stuck in Dealey Plaza, but they try to make the point that, you know, nobody would care about King. And there are some that don't, but I mean, within the real research community, we looked at all of them. But it's a whole framework, and there's a framework from many perspectives that don't want to look at this for any number of reasons. But on the other hand, they can't, no matter what they've done, all these specials, you know, Walter Cronkite, it just doesn't seem possible that one man firing from one location, he points up at the 6th floor, could have done this sort of damage. It just doesn't seem possible. He said, but he was firing at the President of the United States. Oh, thus the laws of physics are suspended. Now I get it. It was a transcendental moment, like Mailer says, you know. Not only was the bullet magic, the assassin was. He sank down through 3 or 4 floors to the coke room, you know, magically, you know. It was a transcendent moment. And, you know, but whether it seems possible or not, I mean, there it is. I mean, and what is reality? You believe what you want to believe, and you stick in your box, or you look around. And luckily, there's some people with some courage, like people that are in this room, who don't come necessarily from perspective like I have at all, but they come from the perspective of decency and truth and justice, and they want reality to, you know, to be exposed, even if it's rough to say it, you know. I mean, how many Paul Schrades are there in these cases? I mean, King has some friends that talk. John Kennedy seems to have fewer. You know, Malcolm has some that talk, but the people who really support him, that's where it should first rest. But it's a public issue, and they belong to all of us. And you know, Dr. Francesco said that he wouldn't cut into King's body out of honor for the family. Or you have a family that say they don't want an autopsy done. Well, the reason you give a DA and a coroner the power to override a family who may, for their emotional concerns, want to have a closure, is that there's a public interest in any murder or any death. And then beyond that, there's a historical interest, certainly, in deaths at this level. And so you have to have the power to say, well, I realize you don't want us to look into it, but we're going to do it. You know, and if it means cutting the body open to find the path of a bullet, it's more important to know that. I mean, you don't say to the Kings, like, you know, well, okay, you don't want an autopsy, we won't have one. Because at that point, he no longer belongs to the family alone, he belongs to all of us. And these cases belong to all of us, and this issue belongs to all of us. And unless we just want to write off history and say it doesn't matter what happens, I'll just take care of myself and my family, and I'll do what I want to do, and to hell with what happens around me. But that's what we called this killing hope. Killing the dream with King, killing hope in Dallas, killing democracy. Because that was their implication. And if we want to live in a free world, want to live in a democratic society, we have to ask these questions. From whatever perspective, it seems to me. Whether it's a scientific, historical reality, or whether it's, you know, because we want a different kind of politic to live in, or we just want integrity and truth in our own lives. I don't know how you get around it, but everything that they do, you know, the Cronkite specials, the Peter Jennings specials, the new movie with Tom Hanks to prove that Vincent Bugliosi is right, that Oswald acted alone. You know, he called me. He said, Mr. Judge, he said, I'm Vince Bugliosi. He said, you probably don't agree with me. He said, I think Oswald acted alone. I said, oh, no, Mr. Bugliosi. I said, I think Oswald acted alone. I think we all do. I just don't think he shot the president. You know, and he laughed and said, well, I haven't had that one before, you know. But no matter what they do, the case won't die. The public suspicion won't die. You know, it's still up in the 80s to 90% are suspicious of it. And this case, as soon as it gets near anybody, is going to raise that same kind of level of suspicion. So you've got your momentum, you've got your issue. Go with it, but go with it in a way that's responsible, because it doesn't depend on your solving the case or speculating what actually happened or whether the Illuminati or reptilian hybrids did it. It just depends on the facts. And if there were two guns firing in the pantry, we've got a different reality. We've got a different situation. We have to deal with it. And it's better in a way to leave the question open. You know, as suspicious as Thane Eugene Czar looks, because unless Don Schulman shot him, nobody seems to be at that angle, you know. So, you know, but I think two is enough. Just in the same way that all I had to know was that a shot came from the front of Kennedy and a shot came from the back of Kennedy. I don't have to keep trying to figure out exactly who was where or what shot comes. You go to the next level. You start looking into who the patsy is or why did they do it, you know. You don't have to prove things. And the gunmen, if you could know them, often don't lead you back to anything anyway. And in this case, it's a closed enough universe that, you know. And I believe there are lone assassins, but I think that even if Oswald was in the window and was the only one doing the shooting, it doesn't mean there wasn't a conspiracy. Because you have to ask who Oswald knew and who put him in the window, you know. If you just went with that, you say, okay, Oswald did it. Who's Oswald? naval intelligence, crypto clearance, U-2, and, you know, Jagger-Child-Stovall analyzing the Cuban Missile Crisis photo. Who the hell is Oswald? You know. And, you know, and that's where Phil Melanson went. But the patsies will often tell you more about the hand behind it than the actual gunman would probably be cutouts. And they wouldn't know who they were working for. But the person that they positioned to take the blame, those hands will tell you something. And the hands that take the evidence or destroy the evidence, those hands tell you something. The Dwayne Wolfers with the switched guns and everything. I mean, somebody's got to fix it. And who knows how many motives they have for what they're covering up or think they're covering up or doing or getting orders to do. You know, does that mean Dwayne Wolfer knew he was going to be killed and was actively part of covering it up? Who knows? But my friend Carl, who's here, told me one time long ago, and I think he's exactly right, if you want to commit the perfect crime, control the investigation. And so you make sure you have that control in place, no matter what, you know, the particulars are, then you're in a position to make sure that the truth doesn't get out. But there's a lot of ways to look at it, but I think it matters less in the particulars of getting everything right about who was shooting in a particular situation than it does about understanding the thing in a broader sense. But until you find out that there's two shots, two guns, whatever. I was thinking last night that the characteristics of a single bullet prove a second gun. So we have both the single bullet and the second gun theory in one package. But you know, we're there, and like I think Bill's right, it's a tipping point, Paul. And your persistence, all of our persistence, is the only thing that makes it work. And your courage in taking that stand for your friend Bobby, you know, and he was a different guy. I looked at the McClellan Commission, the Rackets Commission records, and there was a letter in there from the White House, on White House stationery, from Richard Nixon, the Vice President of the United States, because they had put Giancana in jail for refusing to testify. And they had subpoenaed his testimony, refused to testify. They held him in contempt, and they put him in jail. And he was the head of the Waste Handlers Union in Chicago and the racketeering. And then they said, well, let's take his second in command, a guy by the name of Jacob Rubenstein, later known in history as Jack Ruby. And they went to subpoena Jacob Rubenstein, and a letter arrives from Richard Nixon saying, don't subpoena this individual. It's in there in the file. Don't subpoena this individual. He helped us with the House Un-American Activities Committee. How does a strip joint owner in Texas, you know, who's got a vagina tattooed on his elbow that he, you know, how does that guy figure out to go to a press conference where Oswald is, and the chief of police says he's with the Free Cuba Committee, and Ruby says, no, it's the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. How does this strip joint owner know the difference between the Free Cuba Committee and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee? How does he know what Oswald was part of, unless he knows Oswald and he's not in on the game? You know, so I mean, people show themselves to you, but it's a different world. But can you, I mean, is that in your frame of reference that the Vice President of the United States in the 1950s would write to the McClellan Committee and tell them don't subpoena Jack Ruby? He's a pal of ours. You know, and then when I went in Dallas, I don't know if you've ever been to any of the Dallas conferences, but there's a weather tunnel that runs from the hotel up on the hill down to the train station, which is across from where we meet, and sometimes we eat in this fancy hotel up at the top that turns around, and so we go through that tunnel, and they've got a Dallas exhibit of history, and one of the exhibits is people campaigning, and there's a picture of Eisenhower campaigning in Dallas in 1954, I think it is. But there in the picture, right behind him, right over his shoulder, is Jack Ruby. Okay, so, I mean, these people are part of history, and when you go into the history, and I'm sure that just like Pena and Hernandez and these guys in the LAPD had a whole other history, I'm sure Thane Cesar at Lockheed and other places working for Hughes, he has a history of something that put him in that position, somebody that told him to stand there. But even if we don't know who the second gun is, proving a second gun puts it back in their lap. And that's why I do this work. Put it in their lap. Let them say what the hell's going on. Make them wiggle. Because they like it when we speculate. Then they say, oh, you're just speculating. Well, we're not speculating. Here's the proof. You explain it. And that's what it does when you use the facts instead of making up things. You know, and it's the same feeling I have about a lot of the 9/11 truth stuff, is that stop speculating. And somebody asked me, what's the next step, Mr. Judge, for the 9/11 truth movement? I said, some research. We have to do some research, and we have to get the files loose, because we can't critique the report without the record. So, but let's try to stick to the best evidence of the facts, and that's what I think we had this weekend, and I really appreciate everybody coming out. I don't see Paul, so I don't know what the status is on whether we can get Ted back here.
No, he's not coming.
Not coming, okay. But I'd like to keep COPA going. I can't do it on my own juice. I don't have any juice. I've been out of full-time work since January of '07, and just scraping along, a lot of times in arrears on my bills. But I'm trying to do, you know, the work that I think needs to be done and let things happen. But if you think COPA is valuable, then support it. We have a deal for $50. You can get a set of the 2007 conference as soon as Ralph makes some more. And I'm thinking of maybe putting all of our 5 conferences together on a DVD this year, and maybe, you know, for a $100 donation you can get everything that happened the anniversary year. But we'll try to give you something back for what you donate. The money goes to good use, and I, as you can see, try to get the least expensive options. Attention bowlers. The truth about Robert Kennedy in room 2. So, you know, but I don't mind going to a more expensive hotel, but they're getting pretty outrageous. Unless they want to, you know, sometimes tell them they're just a little nonprofit, and then they say, okay, we won't charge you $800, we'll charge you $300. You know, but it deserves a good location. But I'd like to go forward with that, and I'd like to go forward with the Hidden History Museum. So if you feel moved to donate, people here have been. I've got people in the crowd that are keeping us alive, but and also to just tell other people about us. Tell them to go to politicalassassinations.com, because they'll have fun when they go there. John Garrity's getting great stuff up every day. There's new stuff on the blog and on all the cases, and you know, get us more hits, get us more attention, get more people out to the conferences for us. Politicalassassinations, plural.com. And it's Coalition on Political Assassinations is the name of the group. We're now a coalition of individuals rather than organizations. Citizens for Truth about the Kennedy assassination, and the Committee for an Open Archives pretty much folded. Assassination Archive and Research, Jim Lazar's group still exists. He was an originating group, but pulled back. And there's people continuing to do the work. There's other conferences that go on, and Cyril Weck's conference is important, and he's continued to raise questions, but he's under tremendous attack too. I mean, he's 85 federal counts brought against him, and all of his files stolen, and you know, so, and even when he wins the case, they still keep going after him. They're politically motivated, you know, prosecutors in this, and but the cracks are in the system. I mean, you know, and you drive your wedge where you can, but this Bush administration is falling apart. I mean, we're going to have a bill in Congress introduced. It's not going to go anywhere, but it's going to be in the historical record pretty soon, with 100 verifiable counts that are grounds for impeachment and would be grounds for impeachment for any kind of rational or legal constitutional scholar, anybody except John Yoo, you know, who thinks anything's okay as long as the president does it, you know, and tells him so. But it's been probably the worst administration in history. And when I was up there in Congress, I saw things that they were changing that 10 to 15 years it'll take to probably clean out the damage these guys have done while they've been in there. And they've changed things that you can't. It would just boggle your mind, the regulatory and other kind of stuff that they've taken off track to make the society work in any fair or reasonable way. But they violate the constitutional thing, they violate the separation of powers, they violate international laws, they violate domestic laws, they violate, you know, they obstruct Congress. I mean, it's one thing after another, all the way up to sanctioned torture. And you know, it's So I think, you know, we have to hold people accountable. And it wasn't done in the John Kennedy assassination, it wasn't done in the King or Robert Kennedy or Malcolm X assassination, and it hasn't been done in many other cases since. But until we hold people accountable and have transparency, we can't have democracy. And I like Tom Jefferson, I like democracy. Some of the leftists don't like me for that, and they say I'm ultra-democratic or I'm bourgeois or something, but, you know, I don't have enough money to be bourgeois. But I believe in truth, and you know, a fair shot. And when I thought about mentioning justice today, I thought about, and I'll close with this quote, Raymond Chandler, who wrote novels about Detective Philip Marlowe and these noir novels set out here in Los Angeles. And in one called The High Window, he solves a case, and he's in a rich woman's house, and he goes out on the veranda, and he looks over the garden, and he says the moon was rising behind the trees, and he said the moon was cold and clear and crisp, like the justice you dream about, but you never see. Let's see it. Thank you. So I hope I was half as good as Sherrod.